Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation of the Savannah Council on World Affairs. I'm Roger Smith, a member of your board of directors, and I'm serving as the host for this evening's presentation by Dr. Jeannie Johnson. Her topic is Strategic Culture and the War Fighter, what America's counterinsurgency past says about its security future. It's certain to be a very interesting presentation, and Dr. Johnson's experience gives her the credentials to make this assessment. And I'll give a more formal introduction of her in just a moment. Before I do that, I would like to say a brief word about some of our sponsors tonight. For starters, Kreitz Auto Group is the continuing platinum sponsor of the Savannah Council for the 2021 and 22 year. Kreitz is our exclusive dealer for Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Sprinter vans, and we appreciate their support of our program. Specific to tonight's presentation, we have sponsorship from Morris & Templeton Insurance, and I'll read just a little bit about their line of work. Since 1981, Morris & Templeton has proudly offered personal advice on a wide range of personal and commercial insurance coverages to clients in Georgia communities surrounding Atlanta, Savannah, Hilton Head in South Carolina, and Brunswick, Georgia as well. From time to time, we express appreciation for an in-kind sponsor, and this evening, that in-kind sponsor is the independent, nonpartisan, and fair Daily Chatter. It's an international email newsletter founded on the principles of independence and nonpartisanship and driven by the mission to improve global knowledge and understanding at a time when availability of world news continues to decline in the news media. And now getting on to the introduction of this evening's speaker. Dr. Jeannie Johnson is an associate professor in the political science department at Utah State University and is director of Utah State's Center for Anticipatory Intelligence. Her primary research interest, strategic culture, examines the impact of national and organizational cultures on the formation of security policy. She co-founded the center in 2018 with the vision of creating a cross-disciplinary and leading-edge initiative dedicated to researching, addressing, and teaching threat analysis and resilience modeling that fuses expertise in national security and geopolitics with cutting-edge instruction in cyber threats, data analytics, and emergent technology. Prior to her career in the academy, Dr. Johnson worked within the CIA's Directorate of Intelligence as a member of the Balkan Task Force. That was in 1998 and 1999. And she served with the US State Department in embassies in Paris and Zagreb. The cultural topography analytic method that she co-pioneered was featured in a CIA edition of Studies in Intelligence. Dr. Johnson has conducted in-depth research on US national and military service cultures, including critical blind spots in our foreign and security policies. Her book, published in 2018, is entitled The Marines, Counterinsurgency and Strategic Culture, Lessons Learned and Lost in America's Wars. This book explores the collected impact of three layers of culture: the internal culture of the US Marine Corps, the culture of the US military, and American national culture across 100 years of counterinsurgency operations. She is also focused on the application of strategic culture analysis to the nuclear weapons issue and has co-edited 2 books on that topic. She received her doctorate in strategic studies from the University of Reading and both her MA in political economy and her BA in political science and international relations from Utah State University. As to tonight's topic, she's going to address the way US Marines fight and the strategic outcomes they are able to achieve are determined both by warfighting practices endemic to Marine Corps culture, as well as boundaries imposed by the wider US national culture it serves. The field of strategic culture examines the ways in which both organizational and national cultures influence decision-making within a strategic community. The lessons a nation chooses to learn from its engagements are often more cultural than they are rational. Exploring the lessons that the United States has drawn and those that it has ignored from the last 20 years of counterinsurgent fighting provides critical insight into how the US strategic community is likely to face the future of mixed method great power conflict. Following her presentation, she is going to take questions from our viewers via the Zoom Q&A icon that you'll see on your computer or your iPad. I'll be looking at those questions as we go along, and in the end, I'll be restating them and combining some of them so that she can answer in a timely and efficient manner. The sooner you send in your question, the better the chance it will be addressed before our 8:30 p.m. closing time. And now it's a pleasure to present to you Dr. Jeannie Johnson. Dr. Johnson, we're delighted that you've chosen to join us even from afar. We wish you were here in Savannah so we could host you in person, but we will take your presence in this format with equal enthusiasm. So thank you so much for joining us. It is all yours.
Wonderful. Thanks, Roger. And thanks to everyone for being here. I do wish I was there with you in person. I am a people person in my core. And so I was razzing Roger a little bit that I can't see all of your faces because we're in a webinar setting. And so I've told Roger and Doug and Chip that they have to keep their videos on so that I have faces to talk to while we are going through our presentation tonight. You heard a number of times the definition of strategic culture. That's the primary field that I research and where my scholarship is pointed. But in case you were paying attention to something else while that definition was delivered, I want to say it one more time, only because it's the foundation stone for what we will be talking about this evening. So the sort of thing that I look at is if you look at the cover of this, right, you've got the Marines, and I'm talking about the specific issue of counterinsurgency, and then this other word, strategic culture, is thrown in. And just for those of you who are contemplating publishing a book these days, really, they just want your title to be a list of search terms. So that's why this is such a clunky title. But what it represents is that definition. Strategic culture is the way our national culture, so our shared culture as Americans, and then the culture of our military institutions, so U.S. military culture, which in many cases is largely dominated by the Army. So Chip let me know that we have a number of Army veterans in the audience tonight, so I'll be looking forward to hearing from you. And then also the individual cultures of the variety of institutions that make up our security community. So my former institution, CIA, the State Department, DHS, and all of the individual services. So all of those combine to create what we call a nation's strategic culture, its inclinations as it crafts foreign and security policy. And it's especially important to understand a strategic culture for at least three reasons, at least three that I'm going to sort of tee up for our discussion tonight. The first is that if you're doing something for cultural reasons, because it's just your hardwired preference, it may be the case that that particular military practice, that particular diplomatic approach, that particular mode for assessing intelligence analysis isn't in fact optimal. It's not optimal in absolute terms, or it's not optimal given the specific security landscape that you are facing. So if you're doing it for cultural reasons, instead of as a rational reaction to your security landscape, then you probably need to recognize it as cultural and rethink whether that's the right move. So the first one is just to sort of give us pause and cause us to be introspective about why we are choosing the pathway forward that we are choosing, and which part of it is really made up of our cultural default settings instead of genuinely objective, rational decision making. The second reason is that if you understand service cultures really well, you do a better job of assigning the right institution to the right tasks. And you understand in advance the obstacles and limitations that are going to be involved with assigning an institution to a task for which it is not a good cultural fit. So I'll tell you, for those of you who know and love Marines, I don't think this story will surprise you very much. But one of the units that I was interviewing during the sort of extensive research process for my book had been stationed in Iraq, and I was asking them about passing out humanitarian aid. And this Marine admitted to me that his unit had not passed out the humanitarian aid. They had Willie Petered it, meaning they had burned it with white phosphorus. And I asked him why he did that instead of passing it out. And he said, "Ma'am, we are not the soccer ball force, ma'am. That's the National Guard." And, it was hard not to have kind of a strong reaction to that statement. I said to the recon Marine sitting next to him, "Did you pass out your humanitarian aid?" And he said, "Well, we didn't burn it, but we didn't pass it out either. I drove it over to the National Guard and told them they had to pass it out." Now, one way to unpack this is that there is a core identity that Marines believe is their right. So when you sign up with a recruiter and go through the transformation process that allows you to become a Marine, you have made an enormous sacrifice and a compact with an organization in order to receive a certain set of identity goods. And for Marines, it is joining the finest fighting force in the nation, in the world, right? From their perspective. And so when they are asked to do something that they believe might diminish the way their identity acts as a force multiplier for them, they have this sort of fierce bullets for breakfast identity. And they believe, and evidence seems to indicate, that in many cases, it wins battles for them. There are battles they don't have to fight because they arrive in a place and just the reputation of the US Marines means that some combatants go elsewhere. So we have some evidence of that in Afghanistan, less so in Iraq. But for them, defending that identity is worth risking the ire of your, lieutenant, or, not sort of making the effort to go be the soccer ball force because it runs directly contrary to that identity. Now, that may in fact be a counter-strategic move. That may in fact undermine US strategic objectives in the place where these Marines are stationed, but they are protecting organizational identity at the expense of strategic objectives. And I'm sure they don't necessarily think of that way. It's a more visceral exchange and decision-making process than that. But that's a good example of where you're making a decision for cultural reasons, for identity reasons, rather than strictly for strategic objective or mission accomplishment type reasons. Now, as I say that, please let me be clear. Most of the Marine units passed out their humanitarian aid. They did not burn it. But these two being willing to do what they did shows you that tension with the identity of being part of the Marine Corps. Now, as I explained to our hosts for this evening, I've decided to do something a little different. As an educator, I do Zoom all day, every day with my classes, and have prepared more PowerPoint slides than any human really ought to across their lifetime. So what I've decided to do for this evening, and I hope you enjoy it, is something sort of closer to show and tell. So I have a lot of artifacts that coincide with the research I have conducted across time. And I want to invite you to ask questions across kind of a wide repertoire of subject matter. So my areas of interest and the areas that I've researched include, of course, the United States Marine Corps, but in specific terms, probably an era. And an episode near and dear to my heart is the Combined Action Platoon Program. So here is a set of 14 Marines and their Navy corpsmen who were involved in the Combined Action Platoon Program in Vietnam, and some CRATs that they sent me. So I hope that's not bringing back memories for anyone in the audience, because I can't imagine that they would be positive memories. But these both are representative, and they're leather handmade insignia. They are representative of a particular era and a particular program that has never again been replicated. So the Combined Action Platoon Program, and really the full extent of Marine counterinsurgency experience, going back to Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, of course, Vietnam, and then our 2 theaters, both Iraq and Afghanistan. Any questions you have about that counterinsurgency history, I'd like you to be invited to ask them. For those of you who are Army and you're not sure you want an entire hour full of Marines, which I totally respect, or Air Force or Navy, I also have made a study of US military culture, which is its own separate and distinct sort of culture, apart just from, devil dog culture with the Marine Corps. So we can talk about that. That is the culture that typically is referenced when outsiders talk about American strategic culture. What they're really talking about is US military culture. And then the last layer is American national culture writ large, and the ways that it tends to percolate up and impact our foreign and security policy. And you might be thinking very justifiably, how could you possibly capture something like American culture? We have so many different subnational components. Someone like me who is from the West, and specifically, I think you all know Utah has its own very distinct culture. It's separate from any other state in the United States. So here's my answer to that. What anthropologists and ethnographers and others have found is that because our security institutions themselves have such a powerful acculturation process, once you join the DoD, or once you join the CIA, or you join the State Department, there's a really strong socialization process across those communities that enhance some parts of American culture and tend to either mask, diminish, or not select for other parts of American culture. So what you get is a shared American culture across those decision-making bodies that is kind of a selection of American culture, not an equal representation of all of our different and varied and colorful subcomponents. So that is the kind of layer, I guess you could say, of American national culture that we would talk about. And finally, if you're interested in CIA, where I spent some years, I'm really happy to talk about that as well. So the talk that I have prepared for you this evening is a forward-looking talk. So based on what I have come to understand about our counterinsurgency history, so stretching across about 100 years of counterinsurgency history, what are some patterns, some lessons we should have learned but didn't, or the way we have chosen to perceive that history that then will have impact on our future conflicts and future warfare. Now, I use that word warfare perhaps a little bit loosely, because what I want to talk about tonight are 3 main areas of competition that the United States is currently engaged in with other near-peer powers. The first area is influence operations. The second area is the next conflict, whatever that's going to be. And the third area is preserving the democratic model as the model of choice for governance into and throughout the 21st century. Now, if you're thinking, is there really a contest for the democratic model? Hasn't it already proved itself? That precisely that mentality that we have as Americans is in fact the weak spot that's being exploited by authoritarian adversaries right now. So let's start back at the beginning with influence operations. Influence operations are a component of what is currently called gray zone warfare. So gray zone warfare isn't warfare. Gray zone warfare is competition, really intense, intentional competition by revisionist powers, meaning other powerful nation states who would like to see the power structure on the world stage shifted. And in specific terms, would like to see the US position of leadership undermined. would like for us to not have the influence that we currently wield on the world stage. But they intend to do it in a way that would never quite tip us into kinetic conflict with them. So ways to sort of erode at the different pillars of US leadership, shift the positions of power held by us, held by Russia, held by China, Iran, even North Korea, without ever triggering a sort of conventional war with the US. So influence operations fall within that spectrum of activities that we call gray zone warfare. And we have some room for improvement with influence operations. And our competitors know this. So they have studied us. One reason for studying our own strategic culture is that our adversaries are studying our strategic culture. They know probably better than we do in some cases what are our areas of vulnerability. Where do our habits of practice trip us up? Where do we have a worldview that doesn't in fact match reality? And so the gap between reality and our worldview can be exploited. They study us in order to exploit any cracks in our strategic culture. So we need to be doing the same thing, know ourselves well, at least as well as our adversaries do. So knowing us, one of the things they know that is perhaps most strikingly prominent, and this is where I really wish I could see those of you who are veterans in the audience, most strikingly prominent about our US military culture is a very strong preference for conventional war. Now that may sound so self-evident that maybe it's not even an interesting point, but what it means is that we always prefer to prepare for a peer-on-peer conventional conflict. That's when our Navy would really be able to show its stuff. That's when our Air Force would be able to do what it does best. I sometimes joke with the students and say, that the US is still in a fairly unipolar position as what the French called a hyperpower instead of even a superpower, especially where our Navy is concerned. Because when Hollywood wants to make a movie about the Navy really using its full arsenal and all of its capital ships and all of the weapons attached to them, there's no country on the planet to fight. They have to fight aliens. So Hollywood brings aliens either from the sky or from the sea so that the US Navy has someone to fight. Now, I'm making light of that a little bit, but it's actually not a small point. It's a really interesting point that even Hollywood can't conceive of a scenario where realistically we would, have a run for our money fighting another country's Navy. Now that's changing, as I think probably lots of you know, especially where China is concerned. But right now, even our biggest adversaries like China and Russia prefer to come at us in the ways we least prefer to fight. So knowing that we prefer conventional methods, knowing that we are resource intensive, that we are excellent at logistics, that this is our package of US military culture and US strategic culture, gray zone operations are designed to exploit exactly the opposite. So one of the things they exploit is a weak spot for the United States, which is a complete is perhaps too strong a word, a really underinvested understanding of other countries, their histories, their culture, their priorities, the way they see us. And, just by your attendance in this group, you clearly are someone who is actively engaged in learning across your life. And I would be willing to bet folding money that you also are interested in history and have a bookshelf at home lined with history books. I would like you to also acknowledge that you are the anomaly across the American experience. Most Americans are not well informed on history. In fact, Stanley Hoffman in the 1990s called The State of the American Mind Historical Virginity, because it was so bereft any historic knowledge. This is a feature of American life that D.W. Brogan, in this amazing little book, The American Character. So D.W. Brogan is a Brit who was writing during World War II, trying to explain us Americans to his British comrades back home, comrades not being the right word in that particular context. But this is a treasure, this little book, because here on the back is an apology to the reader that the book is so thin because of paper rationing during World War II. So I'm lucky to have an original copy of that. But he also noted that Americans had no historical interest. De Tocqueville noted it 100 years prior to that. So this has been very much a part of our hardwiring since the frontier days. And in fairness to us, a knowledge of old world history did not help you survive on the frontier. So instead, Americans became forward-leaning problem solvers. That became sort of the American trademark. Problem solvers, looking ahead, valuing change and novelty and innovation and the next best thing, being wonderful achievers and producers, and surviving. So also being risk takers. So that kind of mentality came to dominate the American condition. In addition, as an immigrant nation, and as one that is very young, we also don't tend to value or see as important or weighty cultural differences between people. We come up with trite phrases like people are the same all around the world, or we believe that most all humans respond to the same two big incentives, either inducement through resources or threats of military force. And those tend to be the two blunt instruments that we use over and over again. Now, our competitors, Russia and China, are instead investing deeply and profoundly in understanding other cultures, specifically the cultures that they are targeting with their influence operations. Now, Russia is doing this largely to be a disruptor. So they study us intimately. They have operatives who live inside the United States so that they can report back just on our culture. What makes us tick? What are our sore spots socially? What issues can you raise with Americans and get them at each other's throats? And then their influence operations are designed around those sort of touch points, those hot button issues that can cause a domestic social disturbance in the US. So in fact, in my field, we don't call this disinformation operations or misinformation. We call it hostile social manipulation, because that's the goal. So whatever means you use, including authentic information. So if you hijack something out of an email account that is true, it's not disinformation, it's proprietary information, and it's probably embarrassing information, but you can use it to stir the pot, right? You can use it to get Americans to sort of go at each other. So the Russians are carefully studying us, so they know how to push our buttons. The Chinese are studying us, certainly, but also lots of countries that have traditionally been in the US sphere of influence. And the Chinese are trying to court those countries over to their own sphere of influence. Now, they have every right to do that, right? There's nothing particularly nefarious or certainly against international law about doing that. The problem is that the US assumes a bit too much about its allies and its partners, that association with us just will sort of remain attractive no matter what we do. And here's just such a beautiful example of those two mentalities in action, where China's really investing and understanding one of our partners, and we are taking that partner for granted and not investing and understanding them. I was talking to a colleague who was on a call with our Secretary of State. And this call, so he's in the Dominican Republic, and the call was the Dominican Republic saying, United States of America, so this was not quite a year ago, United States of America, we need your help. We are dying of COVID and we need your help. And our response was, but Venezuela, though, what we really want to talk about is Venezuela, because Venezuela is our priority, and we would need some information from you about Venezuela. And they're saying, but wait, we are dying. We need you to pay attention to that. And we keep saying Venezuela. So not a month later, China swept into the Dominican Republic, and it was China that provided the vaccinations against COVID. And so this colleague, who is very pro-US, reached out to me again and said, are you guys going to show up? What are you doing? You cannot keep taking us for granted, all of these relationships for granted, and not investing them and understanding what our priorities are, while China is swooping in and exerting influence operations, not just rhetorically, but with action. So China is also investing in all of the artificial intelligence infrastructure of these countries. They're supporting scientific projects and labs and building the dignity of a lot of these young nascent research programs. And one of our sort of diplomats went down to the region, and a Latin American diplomat talking to him was quoted as saying, it's interesting. China comes down here and talks about investment and resources and partnering, and the US comes down here and just talks about China. You sound like a jealous ex-boyfriend. So I don't think that's the way we want to be regarded. And it shows a lack of serious investment in understanding the culture, the history, the priorities of our partners. Now, a shining example of otherwise does come out of Marine Corps history. So that CAP program that I referenced earlier, and if we were all in this together, so 10 points to whoever can pinpoint what sort of cultural icon this Life magazine cover is modeled after. What TV show is coming to mind? So if you look at this Life magazine, this was 1968, and this is, 67. And this is a CAP Marine walking with a young village boy. They're headed back to the CAP. These Marines lived with the villagers, came to see the Vietnamese War through their eyes, and learned a lot about Vietnamese culture, ate on the local economy, learned to work with what were called the popular forces, so the Vietnamese forces who didn't make it into the army, and lived and fought in a very different way than Westmoreland was conducting the rest of the war. So they gained enough genuine cultural knowledge that they could track the VC using something like a sixth sense that would go off because they knew things weren't quite right. And all the villagers would have to do would be to sort of give them a look, or just act more coolish when the guys came to get a Coke in the morning, or dig an extra deep sort of bunker inside their homes and make sure that the Marines could see what they were doing. Those were all just sort of implicit signals that because the Marines understood the culture really well, they knew what was going on without any villager having to risk their lives by verbalizing it to them. So they are an outstanding example of how good we can be at this, but it is a competence that we willfully neglect. So willfully meaning anytime we are not losing a counterinsurgency, losing. So we're not making headway, blood is spilling on the ground every day, IEDs are going off, we can't figure out why our strategic objectives aren't being met. When we get to that point, we finally decide to invest in understanding culture. And so you see all these culture centers pop up across the Defense Department. And just as soon as we pulled out of Iraq and Afghanistan, just as soon as we pulled out of Vietnam, all of those culture centers get shut down. So we have not yet made the transition that culturally understanding even a huge adversary like China or like Russia would pay big dividends in our ability to effectively compete with them in gray zone warfare. All right. And oh my goodness, our time is going really fast. So let me just touch quickly on the second two, the next conflict and on the democratic model maintaining pole position within the sort of global community of governing nations. So the next conflict, our entire DoD is preparing to be our preferred way of war. So we've even got a new acronym for it, GPC, Great Power Conflict. That is what we are going to do next. Now, again, this is our preferred way of war, but I would like to toss out the historically based assumption that we might not get it right in projecting what the next conflict would be. We are just as likely to fight another counterinsurgency. If Mexico's cartels decide that they are going to challenge the Mexican government and take it over, just by virtue of proximity to a conflict that big, we would probably step in and help the Mexican government. If North Korea imploded and the South Koreans had to flood into North Korea to secure nuclear weapons and to just stabilize the region, all analysis that we have conducted up to this point tells us that there would be a North Korean insurgency fighting rule by South Korea. And you bet we would be stepping in with South Korea to handle that situation. So you yourselves could probably come up with 3 more scenarios. Even if we were to end up fighting Russia or China, the most plausible scenario is a proxy war escalating over the territory of some poor third party who never intended to be part of the conflict in the first place. In all of those scenarios, the lessons that we could have learned from Vietnam, from Iraq, from Afghanistan would be absolutely relevant. And instead, because this is not our preferred way of fighting, we have nearly immediately buried those lessons. So if you have an active service member in your family, ask them what they're being trained on in the schoolhouses. Ask them if they are reviewing case studies of Al-Qaim in Iraq or Ramadi, where we really turned things around and did it right with counterinsurgency. And I am sorry to tell you that their answer will be no. All attention is focused on Russia, China, kind of on Iran, kind of on North Korea, but completely in this sort of conventional, high-tech, great power context. So we are not absorbing really important lessons that we could have learned from those conflicts. And in the Q&A, if you want me to sort of tick off what some of those lessons are, I would be more than happy to do so. The last area of concern to me is the democratic governance model that I teed up for you. And here it is the faith in the attractiveness of democracy and the misunderstanding of democracy as a highly stable, self-maintaining form of government. It is neither. Democracy requires active, intentional, conscious engagement. If you look across the course of human history, people have over and over given up their democracies in the name of a strong ruler who will take care of their problems for them. Democracies have not had the most stable lifespan. And so, I think most of us thought that question was sort of answered at the end of the Cold War. But here's where we're seeing a brand new kind of resurgence or threat to the democratic model. It is coming in the form of the Chinese data valence system. So if you haven't looked into this, it's worth your curiosity. Sort of Google China social credit system. They use the full range of digital technologies, everything from facial recognition cameras to the geolocators on your cell phone to the tracking every time. They no longer even use the swiping of cards. You just show your face to a cash register and it does your financial transaction, or you use your phone. But everything about your life, including whether you are jaywalking across the street, is being monitored in the places where China is piloting its social credit system. Then your credit shows up on your phone. So at any time of day, you can pop open your cell phone and see exactly what your social credit score is. And it is tied directly to either social rewards or punishments. So things like your child being able to get into the school that they want to get into, or getting a travel pass to go somewhere that you want to go. And it's immediate. So if you are jaywalking across a road on your way home, or playing your music too loudly on the subway, or eating food on the subway, by the time you get home, your internet speed will be slightly slower because your social credit score has dropped. So this data valence system is a form of governance that micromanages citizen behavior. It lowers crime. It gets wonderful citizen compliance for the policies of the government, and China is selling it. So as they are intervening with their influence operations and really learning about the culture of some of our allies and partners, they are also offering, sometimes gifting, parts of their data valence system, like facial recognition cameras, or investments in that country's AI infrastructure. And China's long-term ambition, to sort of quote our national defense strategy, is to make the world safe for authoritarianism again. And if I'm being honest, I don't think they think of this as any kind of nefarious plan. I think there is a sincere belief that societies are more harmonious and stable, and maybe even life is better for populations when they are micromanaged in this way. Now, I want you to pause and think for a minute, because our contention, and the reason that we're researching this in my center, is that even really well-established democracies are going to find some of this technology awfully tempting. If you can reduce crime in Chicago, if you can quickly rescue people in a disaster, FEMA can pinpoint people who are in distress and you can go help them. There are all kinds of sort of reasons and justifications that you can come up with for government institutions to be able to track the movement, the heart rate, the faces of citizens across their nation in order to accomplish a whole host of sort of public goods. At the end of that line, though, is not a vibrant democracy. So that is something that we really need to be considering as we look at threats to the democratic model. I think we've typically thought of things like Russia invading Crimea, and the threats that are coming from China won't look exactly like that. So I'll end on the iconic Marine image, the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima. It is a reminder that even a service that has the most experience with irregular warfare, the most experience with sort of unorthodox practices like the CAP program, or really investing in understanding culture, even that service chooses to focus on conventional war and a conventional image, and has Iwo Jima as its most highly regarded moment, this moment in conventional battle and conventional form. So that tells you how deeply embedded this is across the American condition. And it tells you that we're facing fairly significant challenges in thinking more creatively about conflict in the future. And with that, I'll end and open it up for your questions.
Great. Jeannie, thank you so much. That was a really compelling presentation. Really, really very interesting. So let me look over the questions that I've gotten here, and I'm going to ask them probably in not any particular order. In your research and your writing and making presentations, in what measure have you encountered reactions, good or bad, from military leadership? I mean, have you gotten pushback?
Yeah. So actually, it's the most fun to do these presentations with veterans because, in our short 30 minutes, I could only sort of give you the top of the peaks of all of these different problem sets. So what I will often do is say, all right, here's one feature of our strategic culture. Instead of coming up with really sensible metrics for measuring our strategic success, figuring out how much headway we're really making, let's choose Afghanistan. Clearly, we were not measuring our strategic success in establishing a stable regime in Afghanistan with measuring sticks that were supplying us with accurate information. So because that's difficult, and because we feel compelled to count things in order to measure success, we end up defaulting to surrogate measures of success that are not meaningful indicators of achieving our strategic objectives. For instance, we tend to count our own inputs to the situation as though they are manifestations of success. So we'll count the miles of road built, or the number of clinics built, or the number of police forces that have gone through our training. These are all inputs. It doesn't mean that they are producing the outcomes that we were hoping for, but we use them as surrogates to say, see, we're having success in Afghanistan. So what I will do with veterans is just turn that over to them and say, all right, guys and gals, what is something you were asked to count while you were on the ground that you knew very well was not actually measuring strategic success, but that was what your reports were made of? And the room will just explode, hands going up in the air everywhere saying, oh no, this, oh no, that, And so I think the truth is, once you've lived this, you have a lot of those questions yourself. You have a lot of frustration yourself. And it's kind of gratifying to have a moment to start to unpack it and figure out why things happened the way that they did. So veterans groups, or even active duty military, as long as they've been downrange, if they are a fresh-faced butter bar lieutenant, it is a little more difficult to have this conversation because they haven't lived it yet.
Right.
But if they have, then it goes pretty well.
So you said just now, guys and gals. Do these cultural tropes, the Marine that destroyed the care packages and so forth, are these applicable equally to women as they are to men?
I have not yet seen significant gender differentiation. And I think that again goes back to the really powerful enculturation that takes place when you enter one of these organizations. Now, because the Marines, you have such a tiny percentile of Marines who are female, right. Then I'm not sure that we have a proper sample size to really make that contention, but I can speak with some authority about CIA. And at CIA, there really is no discernible difference in the approach to problem sets, whether you're male or female.
Right. All right. Could you enumerate the 3 most important lessons that we have not learned in conflicts in the past 60 years? That's a question from Chip O'Brien.
Hey, Chip, and hats off to me if I can do that in 3 minutes or less so we can save time for one more question. Yeah, all right. Number 1, we have not yet learned that we can serve a really powerful and positive purpose if we are the great amplifier of indigenous ideas on the ground, not when we attempt to be the creator of ideas on the ground. Now, just let that sort of settle in for a minute. The counterinsurgencies where we've been really helpful have been counterinsurgencies that had legitimate indigenous leadership, like Magsaysay in the Huk Rebellion in the Philippines. We came behind him, expanded his resources, expanded his abilities, and he was calling many of the shots. He understood his own context really well, had a head for leadership, And that went well. When we come in and attempt to impose sort of the American cultural overlay on a place and rebuild it. So here's one of my show and tell, our stability operations manual. If you leaf through this, it reads like a cookbook for a nation. Here's how you cook the police forces. Here's how you make the judiciary. Here's how you build a functioning legislature. The hubris involved in this is just wild. It's off the charts. So when we come in and amplify something that is already considered legitimate by a critical sector of the population, and we can give it more resources, a louder voice, better ability, we can succeed. When we try and create that from scratch, that's when we run into trouble. So that's number one. And it's a really important one because it's difficult to find anywhere sort of acknowledged as a lesson learned. We have such a strong the buck stops here mentality in the United States, and then that's even stronger in the military, that to acknowledge that any variable is outside of your control, is not something that you can shape, not something you can create, you are looked at as a failure. That is an unacceptable answer. So because that answer is so anathema to American culture, then we refuse to learn it. We refuse to even look at it. Number two, equally important, in all of these earlier episodes like Haiti, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, we swooped in and built more infrastructure than those places had ever seen before. We did an awesome job. The Marines put in roads and telegraph wire, and then built up a constabulary, right? Or a gendarmerie, depending on where you were, that had was better trained and had better weapons than it ever had before. What we don't pause to reflect on is that because we expect to do this on a certain timeline, it has to be efficient, then we end up squashing any local involvement, because they're slow and they're messy and they're not efficient. So we just sort of scoop up these things and do them ourselves. And then because we intend for the central government to provide good things to all of the rest of the countryside, that's why we pave those roads and run water lines and telegraph lines and all of that sort of thing, because we want the central government to be able to reach out into the hinterland and deliver public services. And then we train usually a band of misfits, kind of angry misfits, initially, because they're the only ones who want to work with a foreign force. We train them to police their own people. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at that template and say, are we leaving democracy in our wake? And the answer over and over again is no. We have now set up the perfect conditions for a dictator, and a stronger dictator than that country has ever experienced before, because the dictator now has an internal police force that's pretty well trained. The dictator now has reach into the countryside that didn't used to exist. And so this is what happened in Haiti and in the Dominican Republic and in Nicaragua, and was set to happen even in South Vietnam. And so, and of course, we're seeing the repercussions of this in Afghanistan. The Taliban just got a hold of all of the biometric data that we collected on all Afghan citizens as a census tool to know whether insurgents were in their village or not. Like, are you the villagers who are supposed to be living there? Now the Taliban have all of that, and a whole bunch of other information that they wouldn't have on their population if it was just them operating there. And so we need to reflect on that. We need to reflect on that sort of setup that we create with the best of intentions, but it doesn't turn out that way when we leave. So I know that's only two, Chip, but that's as many as I can fit into just our few minutes and still leave time for one more question.
Right. And okay, one more question then. And actually, I have a little gimmicky question I want to ask you at the very end. It won't take long at all. So here's another question from an audience member. On balance, are you optimistic or pessimistic with regard to our country's future longevity in the face of challenges you cited that we're going to be encountering?
Thanks for asking me that question. So I am a native optimist. I better throw that bias in the mix from the beginning. I don't think I could do the job that I do without being a native optimist, or it would be hard to sleep at night. But let me tell you about a conversation I just had in Glasgow, Scotland. So I was there with a number of allies, a lot of the Ministry of Defense, British Ministry of Defense, but also the military attaché from the French embassy was in our group. And this was immediately after the AUKUS deal. So the deal where we undersold the French and sold nuclear submarines to the Aussies, the deal I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
And this made the French so angry that for the first time
they withdrew their ambassador.
You got it. Okay. So here I am, the only American in the room. We are watching the tragic pictures coming out of Afghanistan, and I'm feeling mortified about that. We just did this AUKUS deal to one of our longest standing allies. I'm mortified about that. I am with NATO allies that the previous administration disparaged. I'm mortified about that, So here I am, again, the only American in the room. And I guess I felt responsible to offer sort of a degree of apology for some of this behavior that honestly is inexplicable to me as a security professional. I have served both sides of our aisle. I've been in this business for more than 20 years. I lost any sense of partisanship a long time ago, but those alliance relationships are deeply important to me. I understand the role they play in the US operating the way it does on the world stage. So I guess I felt like I was somehow responsible to make a bit of an apology for this. And I raised the prospect of Afghanistan, and the British MOD guys around the table just looked at me and said, that's not your problem alone. That's not your choice alone. There's plenty of blame to go around. Like the Brits, we could have done this better. We could have done that better. And I thought, wow, that was a generous response. And then I turned to the French military attaché and said, je suis désolé. I am so sorry for how that went. I don't understand why my country behaved that way. And you know what he said to me? He said, it is a squabble in a family. We will get past it.
Also generous.
So generous. But you know what that said to me? The Iranian defector sitting next to me had good words to say about the US. And what it said to me is, guys, this is ours to lose. People want to have faith in us. They want us to be the best version of ourselves. They're not looking to, sort of nitpick everything we do. They do want us to kind of pull our act together. And if we can do that, even imperfectly, they are still standing by to be our allies. We can't ignore them. We can't insult them and disparage them or hurt them economically. But their maybe loyalty is too strong a word, but their willingness to have US leadership in the world is pretty darn robust. Mm-hmm. And so that gives me a lot of hope. And it also gives me a lot of energy to work at sort of educating this younger generation that the US can be a force for good in the world and that others expect that of us. And a challenge that I'm just going to offer to all of us as adults is a lot of the cynicism, it's coming from the adults. That's what this generation is growing up with. They are growing up with cynicism from the adults in their lives. So wherever you find the opportunity to point out areas where the US has actually made the right decision or has made a positive difference, make sure your children and your grandchildren also know that model, because otherwise they don't even know what they're shooting for. They don't know that image of the US because it hasn't been represented to them by their teachers or by the adults in their lives. So, turning that around does give me some hope.
Right, exactly. So here's the last question. There was a little bit of chatter about the 1967 Life magazine cover. A couple of our audience members thought of MASH, but I think that's actually that's anachronistic. That tells me I'm seeing Andy Griffith and Opie.
You win, Roger. It's the Andy Griffith show, right? Life magazine did not do this by accident.
Right.
They were tying the hearts of the American public to this young Vietnamese little fellow here and saying, look and be proud of your Marines. They are playing that role just in a different place. You are exactly right.
Yeah.
10 points goes to Roger.
That's just as hometown as can be. Isn't that
Right.
something? All right. In a second, we're going to thank you. So stick with us. But I want to remind our viewers looking ahead to our next program. It will be an in-person program at our usual location in Liston Hall at the Skidaway Community Church. That's our usual spot. Dr. Tom Patterson of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government will be addressing the subject, How America Lost Its Mind, Our Crisis of Misinformation. So until then, I know that our whole membership and our visitors tonight want to thank you, Dr. Jeannie Johnston, for your presentation. It was extremely well delivered, very thought-provoking, and I know that you'll give us a lot to think about moving forward. Thanks for great fielding of questions from us as well, and we hope that the next time we see you, maybe in person, where we can host you here in Savannah and show you some Southern hospitality. So good night to everyone. Thank you again, and we'll see you on December the 9th.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.